Hello and welcome to The World This Week. We are live on a weekend synonymous for soothsayers' warnings. Beware the Ides of March. Well, it's been a week of suspicion and distrust with the sudden prospect of a ceasefire in Ukraine proposed after Kyiv's negotiators were forced to the table for talks with the US and Saudi Arabia, coming days after discovering their most important ally had switched off intelligence sharing and military support. The ball now in Russia's court, said the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and for 48 hours it was. The Kremlin considered its response. When it came, it first sounded like a breakthrough. We agree, said Russia's president. Yes, but no but. He said there are nuances needed. Nuance means a very slight difference, a subtle distinction. Kyiv's interpretation, this was more Moscow manipulation.
We agree with the proposals to stop the hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that this ceasefire should lead to long-term peace and eliminate the original roots of the crisis.
It's been a week that's seen some of the worst sectarian violence in Syria for years, taking place in the coastal strongholds of the former dictator Bashar al-Assad. Since reports emerged late last week of Syria's new troops being ambushed by remnants of the old Assad militia, the UN said the military operation in response spiraled from clashes to religious killings of any Alawite in the vicinity. Hundreds of people, entire families, including women and children, alleged to have been killed. We'll assess how fragile and divided the new Syria is and whether the killings have undermined the new leader's effort to end his country's isolation.
We have announced the formation of a fact-finding committee to investigate the events in the coastal region, bring those involved to justice, and to reveal the truth to the Syrian people.
It's been a good week for Mark Carney, the man once dubbed the rock-star banker. Polls suggested he was hardly a recognisable face in the country 2 months ago, 75% of the public not knowing who he was. Now he's Prime Minister, overwhelmingly voted in by Liberal Party members to replace the resigning and tearful Justin Trudeau. Well, national elections will follow, and the new PM's already in the thick of it, dealing with his neighbours, the US President's tariff threats and territorial grabbing rhetoric. It's playing well for Mark Carney's popularity. He's talking tough, fighting back. The former amateur ice hockey player has taken to responding in metaphors. He says his style will be elbows up, not skating away. His party says he's not pucking around.
We didn't ask for this fight, but Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. So the Americans, they should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win.
We're in the middle of the month, and superstition and soothsaying aside, March the 15th, well, there are no backstabbers amongst us on the panel tonight. In the studio, we have a knight with us. Amar Abed-Rabot, French-Syrian photojournalist, awarded the Knight of Art and letters from the French government for his work. Amar, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you with us. And since you were last on the programme, your work has been exhibited for the first time in 14 years in Damascus. Tell us about that.
It wasn't only my work. It was a collective work, but I worked on this exhibition. And it was an exhibition to show many of the people who were journalists, but also who were fighters, who some of them were killed during these 14 years of war. And some others were actually with us at the opening of this exhibition. And it was to show their life. I mean, many were killed with a camera or with a gun. And they were presented by the Syrian regime as terrorists, but many of them were fathers or librarians or people who singers, or they love to dance, they enjoy life, they love life. So we wanted to show their images as people who love life, and as well as their images on the battlefield, and it was amazing to do that in Damascus today, you know.
We're going to talk about the situation in Damascus. I also want to know about your time, just feeling and experiencing the city in a time of a new challenge. We're also seeing some images of another one of your recent assignments, which was the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah.
Exactly. It's always funny to go from this place to another, and to be able to shoot very different stories. And the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah, of course, for me as a Syrian with the revolution, and who know what Nasrallah and his people did in Syria, and the harm they did, it was it was very interesting to witness this. But still, it's a historical event. It's something. Some of my friends say I'm a funeral photographer because I've been at Queen Elizabeth. I've been at many Arab leaders' funeral, like Assad, Hafez al-Assad, or King Hussein of Jordan, or King Hassan of Morocco, etc., etc. So yes, some moments are totally unmissable. Let's say you have to be there as a journalist, as a photographer, and you know that some pictures might remain for ages. Then about Damascus, what's going on there? I don't want to take the time from everybody else. I would need more time to talk about it. But it is a society in the making. It's like a laboratory. You know, they don't know exactly what is possible, what's not possible. Now, these days, it's Ramadan, so many people were like, can we have a coffee in the day? Can we meet or should we meet after when it's night, etc. So people are checking. Nothing is sure.
You will have plenty of time to talk about it, Emma. Don't you worry about that. It's a great week to have you as well, particularly prescient this week. Thank you. Also with us, Caroline Diller, friend of the programme, Paris correspondent for the German broadcaster ARD Radio. Thank you for being with us. A big week for the German government.
Yes, of course. We just have the news today that actually the government's or the CDU big spending program has been approved by the Green Party. So the way is now paved for a changement of the German constitution so as to allow more spending on infrastructure and also on military dispenses in the future. And it was quite interesting because it is the German Bundestag, which is only in office until the end of the month. But they have actually now paved the way to change the constitution to make this important spending possible.
This is a big moment because they talk about the black zero and not wanting to go into debt. It goes back to years and years. And we saw the message today from the Chancellor in waiting, Friedrich Merz, saying Germany is back. But you were mentioning a moment ago, the Greens won't particularly be happy with the way they were treated over this, would they?
They weren't, and in my opinion, in my reading of the situation, they were right about it because throughout the whole campaign, the Greens were the party that was actually most attacked by the CDU. And then after, on the election night even, the CDU suddenly realized that they were in need of their support. And so the way they were approached changed. Now the things that they were actually demanding right from the start are being put into practice by the very person that actually criticized them before. So I can understand that for them it was really not an easy time, but they were also not the ones who just treated back and said, okay, we are out of this and we are not going to support anything of which we are convinced that it's important. So yes, I think that they have proven a great responsibility.
Right. Great to have your take this week in a week where European politics have played big in what's going on in Ukraine as well. Let's go to London. I want to bring in Francis Durnley, the co-host of Ukraine the Latest for The Telegraph, executive editor for audio. Francis, fantastic that you're here with us and hear your analysis tonight. Your podcast, 3 years in, more than 800 episodes, 1 million downloads, more now, and you have a Ukrainian version thanks to AI. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me at this golden historic moment for French and British relations. Of course, it's a pivotal time in relation to the war in Ukraine and indeed for Europe. But yes, we have been covering the war on Ukraine the Latest now for the best part of, well, over 3 years. And you list the number of episodes. It seems extraordinary to me to be covering it for that length of time. We decided that this was a moment when really you feel that Ukraine needs to feel the voice and support of the West, particularly with everything that's going on in the United States. And so we, using, as you say, cutting-edge AI, we've been recording this podcast every single weekday, going in really granular detail on the military and the political. And we wanted to be able to provide that service to people in Ukraine who could hear our coverage of what's going on in these major critical summits that's not only determining Europe's future, but also Ukraine's.
It's a great listen, Francis. It's brilliant. You and Dom, you do a fantastic job. And am I right to say, let's take a listen, in fact, to the podcast, because it sounds like your Ukrainian is with your own accent. Let's take a listen.
From today, each episode of Ukraine the Latest will be translated into Ukrainian.
We want to ensure those most affected by the war can access our coverage.
Отже, я звучатиму так.
А я буду звучати ось так.
To be clear, this is AI helping to present our journalism, not produce it.
Click on the links to help us spread the word.
Thank you.
That's pretty impressive, Francis. So it takes us over to the Ukrainian capital. Let's bring in France 24's Kyiv correspondent Gulliver Cragg. Gulliver, excellent to have you with us too on a week. Your insight is going to be very much appreciated. And a week that I see you've sent your last ever tweet, or X, another journalist leaving the platform.
I really left the platform, I think, at the moment when Elon Musk decided to rename it X, except that I lapsed a few times, couldn't resist replying to some tweets here and there. Of course, one has to log on to it all the same sometimes to get information. It's frustrating, I find, that more people haven't left Twitter and boosted other platforms. But there's, of course, a problem that there doesn't seem to be consensus about what the best one is. I'm using Blue Sky. That's what I'm trying to boost at the moment. Yeah, but I really think, I mean, look how Elon Musk is using Twitter to further his interests and has removed all checks on Twitter being used for nefarious purposes. I'm frankly very, very surprised that more people and more institutions, because it would really be institutions leaving Twitter that would create, I think, the snowball effect that we need.
Yeah, Gulliver, I think it's probably fair to say there's not many journalists who believe it's a better place now for journalism than it was a number of years ago. Gulliver, great to have you with us, which takes us to events in Ukraine. 3 years, 19 days since the full-scale Russian offensive began. And this week dominated by two key moments, one on, one off the battlefield. First in Kursk. Reports emerging over the weekend that Russian border territory, first taken by Ukrainian forces in a counteroffensive back in August, was being lost, and rapidly. A card Ukraine did have to play in peace negotiations, no longer a bargaining chip. Kyiv has been without intelligence support, military aid too, from the US, after it was paused by the Trump administration and coincided with an intensified push from Russia, supported by North Korean troops. A key Ukrainian supply line said to have been breached. Then President Putin, in full military fatigues, took a media moment to survey the scene for the first time since last summer, dressed for war in a week of peace talks being held in Jeddah between Ukraine and the US. Western observers noting the non-verbal messaging of how the optics of Russia's leader is never a coincidence. Well, after 8 hours of those talks in Jeddah, a 30-day ceasefire proposed, Marco Rubio made it clear it was time for reciprocity from the Kremlin.
We'll take this offer now to the Russians, and we hope that they'll say yes to peace. The ball's now in their court. But again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
So would Russia's recently revived relations with the US put back on ice if the answer from Moscow was no to a ceasefire? Would President Trump play the leverage card that he says he has on Russia and tell the press what it is? Or would President Putin say yes?
In my opinion, in these conditions for Ukrainians, it would be good to get a ceasefire, at least for 30 days. But there are some details. What details? Firstly, what are we going to do with Kursk region? When we stop hostilities for 30 days, what does it mean? That everyone who is there is going to leave without fighting?
Francis, Michael McFaul today, the former US ambassador to Russia, said he wouldn't be surprised if Donald Trump walks away from talks if President Putin doesn't play ball. He compared it to the first administration talks with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, and after engaging with him, he didn't get a deal, he walked away. So the Americans are using this ball in the court metaphor. Where do you think the ball is right now?
Well, I think it is in Russia's court to a degree, but I agree that I think really we need to see this in the wider picture, which is that the United States clearly does not want this war to continue, and really fundamentally because it doesn't want to be distracted by this. Donald Trump's priorities are domestic and economic. He has little concern for the nuances and sophistications of foreign affairs, let's be frank about this, and so he wants it to stop. He wants it to end, and if it doesn't go his way, then then I think it is entirely plausible that he will seek to pull out. Indeed, there's already evidence that the United States is looking to pull out of Europe, and there are now fundamental questions one has to ask about whether NATO and Article 5 really exist anymore as a consequence of the decisions that are being made by this White House administration. And I think that ultimately we need to, in Europe, be preparing for the very, very worst outcomes, which could mean that it is our responsibility for our own security to do more for Ukraine, not just in terms of material, but also in terms of potentially putting peacekeeping forces on the ground, even if Moscow says that that would mean an escalation in their language. But they've been escalating this war for over 3 years. So I think really it's a bit rich coming from them.
Yeah, Gulliver, when we listen to Francis about just pushing what Ukraine wants and needs despite the sound and fury from Moscow, since the Ukrainian delegation returned from Jeddah and since their debriefing, what's your understanding from Kyiv on what compromises Ukraine had to make in the room in Saudi Arabia on the ceasefire? Was there more to it than first reported?
Probably there is, but the Ukrainian side have said that they didn't come under any pressure to promise territorial concessions. Donald Trump then said that they had actually got out a map and that they'd already talked about what bits of territory Ukraine would keep and what it would have to give up. The Ukrainians aren't admitting to having talked about anything like that, but to just having talked about the parameters of a possible ceasefire. They claim that if the talks went on for 8 hours, it was because they were talking about the very complicated issues, actually, that Vladimir Putin then brought up in his yes, but answer on Thursday, such as what kind of a monitoring mission there might be put in place in order to see who is violating, whether the ceasefire is being violated and by whom. I mean, I hate to say this, but I do think Vladimir Putin is right on that one point, that it's very hard to imagine what kind of effective monitoring mission could be put in place between 2014 and 2022, when the front line in Donbass was only 400 kilometers long. The OSCE mission that was supposed to monitor the ceasefire famously worked office hours, didn't monitor it at night, and even during the day, never really came down on one side or the other as to who was to blame for the ceasefire violations that happened almost every day. Now the front line's, nearly 2,000 kilometers long, as Vladimir Putin said. The Ukrainians claim that the Americans have got a plan for that. We don't know what that plan is, but it does seem to me to be quite an important sticking point. And so you can understand why maybe that's why they had to talk for such a long time. And it wasn't necessarily actually behind closed doors talking about concessions that Ukraine would be prepared to make in the future peace negotiations if they happen. But clearly there's a lot of speculation that they might have also talked about Kursk, whether it's because they didn't have US intelligence or because they actually agreed to give up. The Ukrainians did crumble in Kursk region very, very fast. Some Ukrainian military sources are still saying they could fight back, but it doesn't look likely.
I want to pick up on Kursk in a moment. It's a very good point that you make. Amma, when we listen to Gulliver talking about the sheer scale of the border now and going back to why European forces had these meetings, these 3 meetings so far of the so-called E5, the biggest defence group, saying that maybe there's a way we can monitor this, but being ruled out, as we heard, by Putin so far. There's 2 points that I want to get your thought on from President Trump saying, first of all, it was an incomplete statement from President Putin, but also, quote, that I'd love to meet. Are we seeing the stage being set up for a Putin-Trump summit on the track?
Probably now. I'm totally lost sometimes with the Trump announcements, because here we are a few weeks ago, with this terrible moment at the White House, and then a few days later, they stopped totally the military cooperation, and then they're back yesterday or 3 days before, just after the Jeddah agreement is signed. While, in fact, from what I understood, President Zelensky went to the White House to sign something similar to what was signed in Jeddah. So it seems like it was all just a show. It seems like it's very light. It's very. It is worrying. I'm worried because we have similar things, much worse in the Gaza affair in the Middle East, and you know how much we are very much attached to what's going on in Ukraine, because we think if the West, let's say at the Obama time, stopped Russia in Syria, Russia wouldn't have gone to Ukraine. It would have been a clear signal of being firm and being tough. So we think our destiny are quite close to the Ukrainian people, and we're very much in solidarity with them.
Caroline, listening to Amma talking about what they came away with, I guess one thing they didn't come away with the first time round was a minerals deal. They got to sign the idea of a jointly proposed truce. That's still in the offing. Something else that interests me at the moment that you all have been looking at, which is this E5 group. Tell us about this. We've got created in Paris after Trump's re-election. So it's France, Germany, Italy, Poland and the UK. What were they looking to do this week?
They were actually looking how to support Ukraine on the long term, even in the perspective of a possible ceasefire and an even further peace agreement that might be signed in the future, even though we don't have any indication that this is going to take place in the near future. And so European states and those 5 states are actually the ones who are militarily most implicated and the strongest. They are now looking as to, okay, how can we actually pool, for example, industrial capacities to produce the protection that Ukraine might need? How can we support ourselves in the future in the wake of a potential US withdrawal from Europe? So those are negotiations that are taking place at the moment. And it is interesting to see that especially Germany, which has been very, very, very reluctant in this respect in the future, that they are now trying to take a leading role together with France and together with Great Britain, even though, of course, in my opinion, in my perception, France and Great Britain are the 2 countries that have most advanced on those questions in Europe at the moment.
So, that going on in the meantime, Francis, at the same time, the latest we seem to have in terms of the message from President Putin via Trump's envoy is this more information, additional information and additional signals. It's kind of like, tell me you're in the FSB without telling me you're in the FSB. Also, the how and the why question for you on the ground that Gulliver mentioned, Francis. What is happening in Kursk this week with a rapid retaking of much territory? How and why have Russia been able to move so quickly now?
Well, I think that this will be one of the questions for historians to solve, if I'm honest, because as was alluded to a moment ago, what we don't know is the degree to which the intelligence sharing being cut off by Washington had a role to play in terms of the Ukrainians being obliged and compelled to withdraw from some of the major settlements that they've had to in the last couple of days. I don't think the timing is a coincidence. They've been there for 7 months, after all, and to see this collapse this quickly would suggest that there has been something quite drastic taken place, whether it be something relating to intelligence sharing or indeed some kind of political decision that's been agreed as the price of perhaps putting certain things on the table. We just don't know, which is why I think it will be something that we'll have to wait some substantial amount of time in order to solve. But I think it is a significant moment. Losing that bargaining chip in discussions will have an impact because it will mean that Putin cannot or can now freeze the lines potentially, which he couldn't do before because he would not be able to say that for several months or years that Russian territory was in Ukrainian hands. Now the battleground will just be in Ukraine, and you could argue that puts him in a stronger position with regards to the prospect of future negotiations. But I think we should just underscore here, if I may, the chasm between the two sides, which many would argue is irreconcilable, frankly, because you've got the Ukrainians on the one hand saying that there is no chance that they will ever legally cede territory to Moscow, particularly that land which has millions of Ukrainians on, which is not currently in Russian hands, but has been annexed legally in Moscow. And Moscow saying that there's no way they will ever give up those regions that they have annexed. So how on earth you can reconcile those two positions non-militarily, I don't know. And it's what makes me think, going back to your original question to me, that it is unlikely that Trump will want to solve this question, is likely to pull out, and then it will be Europe's problem.
It's very interesting. Gulliver, one thing that is also worth mentioning throughout all of this, 2 weeks ago, that big row in the White House. Can we talk about President Zelensky's popularity since then, since that episode? Recent polling suggests that Ukrainians are more behind Zelensky than ever. This is The Economist this week, looking at 75% of Ukrainians saying they either highly approve or somewhat approve of Zelensky as a leader. What's your take?
Yes, I think there's more in the somewhat category, but it was a huge boost to Zelensky's popularity when Ukrainians realized how much Putin and also apparently Trump wanted to get rid of him. People who are really harsh critics of Volodymyr Zelensky online were posting on Facebook, if there were elections tomorrow, I would vote for Zelensky. It was a real rallying around the president, mainly, I think, because of the sense that if it's what Vladimir Putin doesn't want, then it's probably good for Ukraine. And also because Volodymyr Zelensky, who has a lot of faults, and we probably don't talk about his faults enough in Western media. He is a man who rises to the occasion. In that Oval Office meeting, I think that he was ambushed. He was under extraordinary pressure. He made a huge mistake in deciding to speak English before the meeting started. But once it had started and he was there having to speak English to these two guys who were bullying him, I mean, I would defy anyone to keep his cool and do better. Some people have criticized that performance in the Oval Office, but most people in Ukraine seem to think that he didn't do too badly under an absolutely appalling amount of pressure from Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. And then other times, such as with his recent press briefing, which we're just showing images of there. I think you might be able to see me in that picture, actually. They've just panned away from me. But I was there, and I was really impressed with Volodymyr Zelensky's performance there. There was a journalist from a US TV channel who was really trying to get him to repeat his allegation that Donald Trump is living in a Russian disinformation space, which had so offended the US president, who we know is apt to react emotionally. And he kept his cool, and he didn't. And he held the line. And I think there is a feeling that while Volodymyr Zelensky is not actually that great at managing domestic politics, not performing well at all in the fight against corruption, he does rise to the occasion on the international stage, and that's probably what Ukraine needs the most at the moment. And some people have been saying that it would be quite good to call the Russians and the Americans bluff and hold elections and have him win. And then, then what would we be saying? What would they be saying? I slightly get the impression that the Americans have cottoned on to that and are not going on so much about the need for elections in Ukraine sooner rather than later.
Eagle-eyed France 24 viewers would have spotted the double Gulliver. I'll admit I have to watch it back to catch you two both at the same time. Let's go to Syria next, where after 14 years of civil war, it's been 14 weeks of the interim government of Islamist rebels who finally brought about the toppling of dictator Bashar al-Assad. Assad fled to Moscow on December the 8th and hasn't been seen since, at least publicly anyway. There's been international hope mixed with doubt and suspicion about whether this interim government, who promised to govern for all, could unite the nation with its many factions, ethnic, religious, military divides. And it's been tested for the first time last Thursday in the northwest of the country, a stronghold of support for the old president, a heartland for those that share the same Alawite faith, an offshoot of Shia Islam. Reports came through of remnants of Assad's forces carrying out organised series of ambushes on Syria's caretaker military. In the days that followed, the new Syrian troops called in reinforcements from elsewhere for an operational crackdown. It led to merciless door-to-door killings, hundreds of people, women, children, families, evidence of summary executions, according to the UN Human Rights Agency. Western governments are in the process of lifting sanctions to help the interim ruler, Ahmed al-Sharaa. He's addressed the nation twice in 4 days, calling for unity, and announced what he promises will be an independent investigation.
We have announced the formation of a fact-finding committee to investigate the events in the coastal region, bring those involved to justice, and to reveal the truth to the Syrian people. We will also announce the formation of a high-level committee to preserve civil peace, which will be tasked by the presidency to directly communicate with the residents of the Syrian coast, listen to them, and provide the necessary support. This will ensure the protection of their security and stability, while strengthening national unity during this sensitive phase.
Amar, let's start with you. What is known now of the background to these events, how it became a build-up to horrifying scenes that we've seen on social media, the footage of these mass lines of tangled bodies in the streets?
Of course, it's a horrible moment. It's terrifying, and unfortunately, it was in a kind expected. I mean, this is something we feared would happen on December 8th, 3 months ago, when the regime collapsed. Fortunately, or I mean, by luck or something, it didn't happen then. But still, you had tens of thousands of people who were armed, who were thugs, who work for Assad, whose main job was to terrorize families, and they suddenly disappeared. They didn't go to Moscow, they didn't go to Lebanon or Iraq, etc. They were somewhere in the country with their weapons, with their will, maybe to do something one day later. So unfortunately, it happened then. There are a few things to notice. First of all, there is a huge, to accompany the horrors that are real, there's a huge war of information with a lot of fake news, a lot of fake massacres, which is terrible because many people talk today about 10,000 people who were killed. Most independent and reliable sources talk about 1,000, which is huge, of course, in a weekend, but it's not 10,000. Many people say, oh, finally, it's the same as Assad. You just changed the name of the leader, but it's the same policy or something like that. And here I don't agree at all, because we saw, as you said, Shara spoke twice, or 3 times even, because there's the Reuters interview, and he condemned the violence. He promised the inquiry, and he asked for the arrest of people who were involved in videos and in shooting, with no doubt that they were there. So this is something totally new in Syria. We haven't seen that in 14 years. We never saw Assad condemning the violence or asking to arrest people who were involved in such violence.
Which then leads on to the question about how on earth you have unity, and how much or little control does Ahmed al-Sharaa have of the different military factions that supported him for the overthrow, and now he has to try to get some kind of authority over.
Exactly. It's a real mission impossible, let's say, for him, and it's very interesting to see, because he needs to be, acceptable by the West and the foreign countries. But he needs to be acceptable by by his own factions that are sometimes terrible, and sometimes they are close to mafias or thugs themselves. And then he has no money at all. The country is broke. So he needs to build an army, to build trust with the Syrians, because many of the people, we talk about the religion affairs, we talk about the constitution, etc. But many of the people are just looking at their salaries or at their daily life. Is it better or is it worse? Do they have electricity? Do they have water, etc.? Which for the moment is lacking. So he has to solve all these things in very little time, because we're talking about 3 months. Mm-hmm. It's nothing. It takes years, of course, to solve these issues. So yes, we're going to watch, and we're going to hope for the best for Syria, but we know it's going to be extremely difficult, yes.
It's worth saying, Francis, as well, much of this going on in a region where Russian forces have its warm water naval base in Tartus. What have you made of Russia and its efforts diplomatically with the new authority? And Ukraine as well, actually, trying to work out if there's a void.
Indeed, well, both sides have sought to try and influence to a degree what's taken place in Syria. But of course, I think we should really underscore the degree to which Bashar al-Assad was supported throughout his tenure by Vladimir Putin, and many of the very worst atrocities committed by his regime were supported implicitly and explicitly by the Russians. And so when, of course, we saw the collapse of the regime, I think it came as a significant blow to Vladimir Putin on the world stage, and particularly with his influence in the Middle East. And his ability to control events in the Middle East is increasingly important for him. Of course, we've seen in Ukraine how he has relied on Iranian-made drone technology to be deployed and able to continue fighting in the manner that he has. And so it is a loss for him internationally to lose such a key player in the Middle East space, which gave him brokerage in relationships with Israel, with Libya and other nations in that wider region. So it's a really significant event. And I think that in many ways we've downplayed in the West what a blow it is for him. And Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation has made it seem like this is now the West's problem. But in many ways it's actually a problem of his making, and one that that no doubt he will seek to try and use for his own ends again.
Francis, that takes us nicely at this point to another big issue this week. This time last week, in fact, we were discussing President Trump's on and off again protectionism, announcing tariffs against friends and foe alike. Mexico, Canada, China, nothing could change his mind, he said, until something did. He deferred some of the import duties on his neighbours, who both announced retaliatory measures. This week's 25% tariffs announced on steel and aluminium imports coming from anywhere in the world, a harsher version of the tariffs he introduced in his first term. Allies of America were said to be exempt last time. No chance this time, he says. They came into force on Tuesday. But Europe and Canada hitting back with retaliatory measures. Donald Trump says it's short-term pain for long-term gain. He wants manufacturing to return to the US to bring jobs, investment back to the country, he says, and he's sick, in his words, of being ripped off elsewhere in the world. Here's Donald Trump on Thursday, reiterating his beef with the EU.
So we sell no cars to Europe, I mean virtually no cars, and they sell millions of cars to us. They don't take our agriculture, we take their agriculture. It's like a one-way street with them. The European Union is very, very nasty. They sue our companies. Apple was forced to pay $16 billion on a case that, very much like my cases that I won. They shouldn't have been even cases, but we felt they had no case, and they ended up having an extremely favorable judge and decision. But they're suing Google, they're suing Facebook, they're suing all of these companies, and they're taking billions of dollars out of American companies, many more than the ones I just mentioned.
So EU is evil as a trade war takes shape. Here's Ursula von der Leyen on the EU's response.
As the United States are applying tariffs worth $28 billion, we are responding with countermeasures worth 26 billion euros. This matches the economic scope of the tariffs of the United States.
So among that 26 billion euros, EU chiefs say they'll tariff your jeans, your whiskey, your motorcycles at 50% applicable from April Fool's Day. Hours later, Donald Trump said he was raising tariffs on EU alcohol, specifically champagne and European wine, to 200% import tax, unless, he said, the EU drops its plan to tariff American bourbon. Well, the markets have not been kind to President Trump this week. S&P 500 down by 9% since its peak in mid-February. Investors appear to have lost faith in the administration's trust us approach. So, Carolyn, a dizzying week. I'm sure when you got the job and you had to interview for ARD, they said, what is the EU all about? And you said it's a nasty organisation designed to upset Trump.
I never said that. I never said that. And especially with the amount of Tesla driving around in Paris, I really have no idea how Donald Trump is saying that they're selling literally no cars to Europe. But anyway, what I found really, really interesting is that it was Tesla itself, like the company, that has published a letter this week saying that they're kind of worried about the potential negative effects of Donald Trump's tariff policy also on U.S. companies. So if he says that it's a short-term pain for a long-term gain, then he has to look at that the long-term gain comes fast enough not to backfire on himself.
And Gulliver, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer doesn't quite know how to play this tariff game right now, does he? He's hoping for a trade deal with the US, hoping for special treatment. Do you think he's likely to get it?
I'm afraid I really don't know what the US policy on Britain is going to be. I mean, I've been too busy following Ukraine, but I do.
Well, maybe it's one for Francis, Gulliver. Maybe you can do a weave with us. Francis.
Well, and I would say that nobody knows either, because we just do not know where this White House stands on almost any issue. But I would say that, of course, it's been Britain's interests ever since Brexit to try and get a special deal with the United States, and we haven't managed to achieve one. And I think it's possibly unlikely that we can expect to see one in short order, at least, although it does seem the relationship between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump is pretty strong. But how long can that last, given the huge fault lines that are almost destined to open up over the war in Ukraine and on European defence?
What I think the question is, if I may come back in,
yeah,
is if you think that Donald Trump's policies are completely crazy, are going to crash the US economy, then you might be thinking that in the actually not even medium term, in relatively short order, the US is going to be a much less important trading partner than it is at the moment, and you'd be better off, relying on the European Union, I suppose. If economists are right and Donald Trump's policies are going to be disastrous, then you perhaps don't want to be counting on them in the future. I mean, my impression is, though, that Donald Trump would like to destroy the European Union or significantly weaken the European Union. And if that is at significant economic cost to the United States, he doesn't understand or doesn't care. This is the terrifying thing about the whole situation we're in right now, is that we cannot count on the rationality of the US president. We cannot think he won't do that because it goes against the United States' economic interests, because he might.
And yet, Gulliver, Francis. Back to me. No, Francis, I think the delay...
I agreed with what was just said.
Well, listen, Gulliver, very briefly to you, because Karen just talked a moment ago about Elon Musk and the problems with Tesla, the slump in popularity, Trump having this moment on the forecourt at the White House, turning it into a showroom, and yet, you can't underscore the amount of importance there is in Ukraine from Musk's Starlight satellite system right now.
Starlink.
Yes, Starlink, yeah.
But there is also the argument that they wouldn't cut it off because they make so much money out of it. And they have repeatedly said now that they won't cut off the Starlink. And at the same time, Ukrainians and Europeans are talking about alternatives to it, replacements for it. But I think that there's still some way down the line before they're going to be operational. And there are other ways, of course, of communicating, but Starlink is much harder to jam, or perhaps impossible to jam. And that's why it's very, very important for the military's communications. But the Americans and Elon Musk himself did, very strongly insist that people were spreading these rumors about Starlink being cut off in Ukraine and that they were absolutely unfounded. I mean, who knows? One thing that is perhaps worth mentioning is that if they were to cut off Starlink, it would be a step further in doing something that would really be one obvious move done perhaps not by the US government, but by, Elon Musk, who is so close to the US government, that, might leave them open to allegations later on that this deal on rare earth minerals and Ukraine's natural resources was signed under duress, that it's a form of extortion. I'm wondering a lot whether or not Ukraine might sign that deal, but then renege on it and say that it had a legal basis for doing so because of the conditions under which it was signed.
Interesting thought. Let's go north of the border. Donald Trump thinks there's an invisible border. It's the 51st state, but we'll go to Canada, which is still a country. 2 months on from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's announcement that he was stepping down for a decade in office, following months of speculation and low popularity. This week, he finally left office, and a new Liberal leader, and therefore Prime Minister, sworn in. It went from tears to cheers in 20 seconds. 140,000 members voted on 4 candidates, overwhelmingly chose Mark Carney, whose potted history includes being a former amateur ice hockey player turned Goldman Sachs high flyer, turned former governor of the Bank of Canada and England. His latest moment in the sun enhanced, analysts say, by a neighbouring trade row. President Trump talking of repeatedly wanting Canada as the 51st state. Now, if he's to last longer in office than a lettuce, he'll have to find a way to beat his Conservative rival at national elections sometime before October. And there's been a recent push to show he's more than a dry banker, a Carney chameleon, if you will. This is a latest in a round of interviews. He's laughing and joking about President Trump's rhetoric with Jon Stewart a few weeks ago.
We find you very attractive, but we're not moving in with you. It's not you, it's us.
I want to get a 30-second take from both you, Carolyn, and from you, Amar, on this. The right man at the right moment. What do you make of Mark Carney? Carolyn?
I have a very good impression from what he said first, but then again, in his first official statement on this evening, he was saying that he was looking to find ways to work with Donald Trump, so that was way more diplomatic than what we've seen just over there. And then what I would like to underline is that he has only been elected by the members of the Liberal Party, so there's going to be elections in Canada held in autumn at the latest, so we are going to see what that will bring, and he will have to do a lot of conviction work until then.
And Pierre Poilievre, who's his rival, the Conservative leader, still on top, only just now. There was a double poll lead for him before. He says this is basically Trudeau with a different pair of socks. What do you think?
From my side, I don't know very well the Canadian politics, but I had the impression that Trudeau was quite good in the last few weeks with the Trump affair. I mean, the way he
remember his last statement. You're a very intelligent man, but this is a really dumb thing to do.
Exactly. I mean, he was quite, and I believe quite popular also. So this is something
good for Europe.
I don't know if it's good for Europe. No, I don't think so. All these turbulences or all this turmoil is not good for Europe. But what is good for Europe is that we have to take our security back again and to build something. This is nice.
You've left us with hope. We'll end on this point. Thank you to my brilliant panel. Second to none. Insights, context from our correspondents this week. Thank you. Here with me in the studio, award-winning photographer and journalist Amar Abed-Rabot. Thank you, Amar. Thank you to Caroline Diller, Paris correspondent for ARD Radio, the German broadcaster. In London, we were joined by Francis Dearnley, the co-host of Ukraine, the latest, a brilliant podcast for The Telegraph. Thank you, Francis. And in Ukraine, to our friend Gulliver Cragg, France 24's Kyiv correspondent, thank you for watching. The World This Week was chosen this week for the best 100 podcasts globally for current affairs. Beware the Ides of March. I'll see you in 7 days for The World next week.